Shifting attention to the United States now, with tens of thousands of security personnel from the National Guard and law enforcement agencies descending upon the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. has now started resembling a ghost town. Security has been bolstered in other state capitals as well, ahead of Wednesday's presidential inauguration ceremony. Following an FBI warning of armed protests, more than a dozen states have now activated the National Guard troops to help secure their capital buildings. Capitals in battleground states where Trump directed his accusations of voter fraud were especially on high alert. A small group of Donald Trump supporters gathered outside Michigan state capitol in Lansing. 4 of those protesters even carried long rifles. In Columbus, armed protesters from the Boogaloo Boys, which is an anti-government group, gathered outside the Ohio state capitol. The building is under high security ahead of U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. Several dozen people have gathered at South Carolina State House, some carrying American flags. The group included Trump supporters who briefly interacted with another group of demonstrators. More demonstrators are expected in the lead-up to President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th. Vice President Mike Pence, meanwhile, visited U.S. troops on the final trip as the Vice President. For more on this story, we earlier spoke to our correspondent, Jagrati Dave from Washington, D.C. Listen in.
We're hearing from the FBI, who've said that there is a possibility of unrest in every single state in the United States. And so many state capitals have been on high alert since then. There have been protests at several places in the country outside several state buildings today. But many of them were small. And according to reports, the media and lawmakers outnumbered many of the demonstrators. Some of those were armed. Some protesters were armed, as you saw in places like Michigan and in Austin, Texas. I think the mass unrest of the kind that we saw, in the United States, Washington, D.C., and the Capitol, haven't yet manifested. But I think looking at the state of Washington right now, with it being essentially looking quite like a fortress, I think nobody is, standing down just yet. Everyone is very much on alert for the possibility of further protest on the day of the inauguration itself. In these state capitals, you've had National Guard being deployed. Here in Washington, D.C., we've got more than 20,000 National Guard troops that are lining the streets and the environs of the Capitol. You've got barricades and barriers that are up to minimize the flow of traffic and people. You've got the area around the Capitol is usually quite quiet at nighttime, but it's pretty deserted, barely a soul in sight. You're seeing a lot of fencing, some of those topped with razor wire. So I think a lot of physical security measures, but we're also seeing, intelligence and security, watching out for traffic to see if they have any indication of whether the chatter on social media is just that chatter or whether that is the prospect of actual planned protests and unrests on the streets.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.